right, what's going on, everyone? Welcome to Decred in Depth. I'm your host, Angelo, and on today's show, we have Mr. Richard Red. Richard, how you been?
I've been pretty well, Angelo. How are you?
Excellent. So let's get right into it. Let's get into your background and your intro into the cryptocurrency space. Where did it all start, Rich?
Sure. So I'm a social scientist by trade. I've been doing research for a while. And one of my favorite subjects has been online peer production communities. Communities of people who produce useful resources online, things like open source software of all different types, but also Wikipedia and Reddit and Stack Overflow and a few other sites like that. That's kind of captured my interest. I got pretty interested in the whole philosophy of commons-based peer production, and that's been my main research interest for a while. So in 2017, I'd heard about Bitcoin before, a few years before, and looked into it and thought it was pretty interesting, but I didn't really see it as being all that relevant to my interests. And then in 2017, I heard about the Bitcoin Cash fork and the sort of scaling debate that had still been going on for a long time. And that sort of caused me to realize that there was a whole governance aspect to this which had been sort of hidden or downplayed, or it wasn't immediately obvious to me like how that was working. So I started to look into it, and I started to find other interesting projects that were sort of putting this governance aspect front and center of what they were doing, namely Decred. And that connected some dots for me and made me realize that actually public blockchain projects were pretty much a good example of a commons-based peer production effort, but also with aspects of other things that I'm interested in, such as common pool resources, which I might talk about later on. But yeah, that's the sort of intro of how I got interested in the cryptocurrency space.
So what was it about Decred that you like specifically?
Yeah, so I mentioned the sort of emphasis on governance, and I liked that they had a clear plan for how the blockchain was going to be governed, but it was a work in progress. It wasn't an elaborate white paper that I would struggle to even read fully. It was more of a basic principle of people vote with tickets, but at the time, Politeia wasn't in production yet, so there were a lot of blanks that needed to be filled, and people were pretty straight about the fact that there were plenty of questions that needed to be answered, things that needed to be figured out along the way. And so that made it pretty obvious that there was a role that I could play in the project. So that was something that, kind of attracted me to it. But really, I think before that, once I joined the chats and started talking to people, I found that I enjoyed interacting with the community. I thought that I was learning a lot from the people that I was talking to about the history of Bitcoin, going into a lot of the sort of questions that I was asking before and I couldn't really answer about how things actually work in terms of this open source software project that everybody runs to make the blockchain. Who decides which version of that everybody runs, things like that, which weren't being well covered at all anywhere else in the blockchain space, but people in the Decred chats were talking about these subjects. And so that I felt pretty at home there. And that's probably the other thing, I guess, would be that there was a sort of general impression that the developers on Decred were really good, which I recognize as being an important aspect of any software project. Having skilled developers is pretty important, but I'm not a developer myself, so I can't assess that. And Decred was one of the few projects I found where external people were actually saying that, these developers are really solid. They're good at what they do. So those are the various things that attracted me to Decred and made me take an interest in it specifically.
And how'd you start contributing to the project?
Yeah. So after a few months of hanging out in the chats and talking to people, I started to realize that, well, I was asking a lot of questions about Politeia because that was the piece that I was most interested in, and it wasn't there yet. So I would basically ask about that fairly regularly, ask different questions, and follow the discussion. Sometimes when I asked a question, it would turn out that there was no solid answer yet, and there would be a discussion, and we'd sort of arrive at a conclusion about what the answer would be. So after a little bit of time doing that, I started to realize that I was able to answer other people's questions about Politeia and how it would work, and I decided to write that up as a post, which I think people appreciated generally. So that was my first sort of proper contribution to Decred, and not long afterwards, I was invited to become a contractor and start like billing for the work that I was doing. And at that point, I looked a bit more broadly at the project and found a fair few other ways that I could contribute, different things that were going on that I was interested in. And so I've had before that I'd had a little bit of experience with commons-based peer production and actually an open source software project. So I was pretty familiar with how that tends to go, where it's an open project and anyone can show up and start contributing. So I just applied the same sort of logic, which is that if you see something that you think needs doing or is worth doing, and it's something that's sort of you're comfortable with, then it's usually appreciated by the other contributors if you actually go on and do it. So I did a few edits to pages on the docs site, and eventually like started writing some new pages that filled in gaps that I'd hit when I was learning about Decred, and I thought I could sort of help the docs site to give people a better introduction to the project.
So what are your current roles and responsibilities now?
Yeah, so right now I'd say it's 2 or 3 different aspects to it. One of the aspects is just recording or reporting what's happening in the community and in the various different sub-projects that make up Decred. I think there's a pretty strong need for that with the decentralized stakeholder governance. I think it's actually really important to provide the stakeholders with good information about what's happening across the project so that they can follow everything with minimal time investment and then be in a position to make informed judgments when they're asked to vote on things. So that's a big part of what I do still. It's mostly involved in the work I do contributing to the journal and to Politeia Digest. The other sort of extension of that would be finding out about things that people in the community need to know about. So if there's some aspect of like the recent example would be the market makers proposals and the Decred liquidity situation. That was something where it seemed like there was a lack of information about Decred's current liquidity as compared to other projects. So that was something that I was pretty comfortable with collecting the data on and doing an analysis of, and it seemed like it would be pretty useful to help people make a decision. So I did it, and yeah, it seems to be appreciated. That's a whole kind of area of just it's all basically an extension of the same thing, which is see something that would be useful or needs doing and like start doing it. Then the other, more recently than that, I've had a couple of proposals approved for the Decred open source research program, and that's really, from my part, it was an attempt to gain a sort of approval to extend the remit of the research that I was doing and to spend more time on doing more kind of blue sky research, just kind of looking at things that were interesting in relation to blockchain governance, not necessarily within Decred, but also within other projects, and basically just following what's going on, what's relevant to Decred, coming up with reports that go into different aspects of it, that kind of thing.
So now I saw that you recently released a book, Crypto Commons. Was that an output of the open source research you've done for DCR, or how did that come about?
Yeah, it was. It came directly from the open source research program. There was a strand of that, which we're calling crypto governance research, which is about looking at the governance of other blockchain projects and asking a set of questions, the same set of questions about each project, as a way to try and give a somewhat standardized overview of the role that governance plays in different projects and how they're doing with that, how it's going for them, what kind of problems they're encountering, or whether they have like approaches or techniques that are proving effective. And then, yeah, the book then came from basically looking at those questions and trying to explain why I was interested in those specific questions. So I started to write an article about that. And then I realized that actually it tapped into a number of different fields that I'd been interested in before, areas of the literature. So in particular, commons-based peer production, which is the kind of thing that I'd always be interested in, but also another area to do with the governance of common pool resources. And I'm trying to like present this information to an audience of people that are interested in blockchains, but I'm also trying to convey to people that aren't interested in blockchains why maybe they should take a look and take an interest and find out about this whole area and approach to technology. So I at some point realized that it wasn't really going to work as an article, and it just kind of got a bit bigger and bigger. And then I thought, well, yeah, it's more of a, there was no limitation, or like nobody was telling me like where it needs to be published or anything to do with how to disseminate this information. So making it a website based book seemed like a good idea, seemed like a good way to round it out and produce something that was basically like it's supposed to be an overall sort of take on my impression about what's important to do with blockchain governance.
Right. So what are the crypto commons?
Yeah, crypto commons. So a commons is a space, like kind of classically, or a resource which is accessible to everyone. And the best known examples would be things like grazing land. Like that's the kind of original commons, was the common piece of land that everybody grazed their animals on. But it's also been studied in relation to irrigation systems and fisheries and a number of other sort of shared natural resources. Then with the internet, there's a way to think about many different digital resources as commons based if the owner of the resource makes it freely available and allows other people a license, or releases it under a license that allows other people to reuse their work and to remix it and to do whatever they want with it. That's a commons based resource. The crypto aspect comes in because when you add cryptography, the way that cryptocurrencies have added cryptography gives the resource a different kind of character. The cryptography allows it to be easily defended. It allows participants to ensure that other participants are not distorting information is the key to it. So you basically, it gives you a way to make sure that everybody's interactions with this resource that you're producing are not being tampered with. They're coming from the people that like made those changes or additions. But even beyond the cryptography, there's also, in relation to cryptocurrencies, a strong incentives component, and that's a huge thing in relation to commons-based peer production, because usually these things are not incentivized. So the examples that I listed, they basically run almost entirely, they derive their value from voluntary contributions from people that aren't compensated in any way. Which is, it's good in some ways, but it also has a kind of limiting effect on how well that can scale. And it also introduces problems with the governance of the resource, because they're not decentralized in any meaningful way apart from the licensing. It means that ultimately, say with Reddit is a pretty good example. Like it's a platform that's owned by a company, and the company has investors, has a requirement to be profitable and to like make money for those investors, which can often be at odds with the users that are actually adding most of the value and like really producing the resource and making it interesting and gaining an audience for it. Like I would say that in a lot of these systems, basically all of the value comes from the users, but it's often being captured by the company that started the platform and then attracted the users.
Got it. You want to give a summary of the book of maybe some of the key points?
Sure. So the key points of the book are that at the heart of every blockchain project is open source software, which is a commons-based, like peer-produced resource. Every like freely licensed open source software is. So that brings in a lot, like it makes the literature about peer production relevant. And once you bring that in and also introduce the literature on common pool resources. So firstly, I think those two fields are not very well known to people that are into blockchains. So I think it's worthwhile to sort of highlight them. But from that basis of thinking about it as something it's made of free software, but it's free software that has to sort of, everybody has to run the same version to arrive at a coherent like blockchain resource where everybody's on the same distributed ledger. And that, from that perspective, it's really more like a common pool resource, which has a lot of there's a lot of literature about how to manage those. And so I go over the different literatures in the book. I introduce some other stuff about motivation, intrinsic motivation in particular, because I think that's also a key part of like the reason why people get involved in these projects is important, especially the developers of the software. So I go over those different aspects of the literature, and from there arrive at a kind of framework, if you like, which is about considering the participants in the governance of any blockchain as being members of different constituencies. And the way that those constituencies are arranged varies from project to project, and it depends on the way that the software is set up. So the kind of the roles that different entities have it's a lot of it's baked into the software, but it also depends, I think, largely on the history of the project and who's like how it's played out over time, who's got involved at different points in time, and how they've been able to occupy different positions in the governance of the project.
So what kind of constituencies are you talking about?
Yeah, so the main ones are the miners, if you like, from Bitcoin, like the proof of work miners in Bitcoin, but really the block producers in every project. So in some projects, it's not miners, it's people participating in proof of stake systems or other methods of reaching consensus. But yeah, so really the main constituency, or one of the main two constituencies, is the block producers. And the other one is the developers who write the software, the people, because without the software, there's nothing there. Like it doesn't exist. So you have the developers of the software have they're usually the founders of the project. Like they basically start it going, they start the ball rolling, and then the block producers come in and start making blocks. And a lot of the governance dynamic plays out between those two constituencies, in my view. There are other constituencies that definitely play a role, and you can see that in some of the stories from Bitcoin's history that I look at. Some of the interesting constituencies are the economic nodes, so the exchanges and other merchants, businesses built on Bitcoin. They get a pretty... People will listen to what they say because their choice of which fork to prefer is important. And you have the users. They're a constituency, obviously, but they often don't have a kind of definitive way to make themselves heard. It's can often be a bit messy when it comes to knowing what the user constituency wants. That's probably the main sort of constituencies. And to give an example of sort of how you apply that framework, I think a good example is like with Bitcoin. I use a lot of examples from Bitcoin in the book because it's been running for longer than any other project and at higher stakes than any other project. One of the key examples from Bitcoin's history is the user-activated soft fork, because before that, I would say it looked a lot like the proof-of-work miners had the dominant position within Bitcoin's governance, because they were able to block a change to the rules that they didn't like, the whole SegWit batch of changes to the consensus rules. The miners, it seemed to like, I wasn't paying attention at the time, but from the resources I've read, it seems like the rest of the Bitcoin ecosystem was pretty sold on the idea that segregated witness was important, but the miners just wouldn't activate it for quite a long time. I think it was over a year. They just decided they weren't going to activate it because it didn't suit them. So if they were able to pull it off, it means that they had a dominant position in Bitcoin's governance. But that all came to an end with the user-activated soft fork because, well, so I should say to clarify, the user-activated soft fork never happened. It was something that a lot of other constituencies sort of rallied around is basically a threat to the miners, that if you won't accept segregated witness and activate that, then we're going to basically remove you from the network. It's going to become a condition to participate on the Bitcoin network that you support segregated witness. So in the end, the miners, they backed down, they gave in, and they signaled the segregated witness support. And then the whole thing came back again slightly later on with the Bitcoin Cash hard fork. But to me, that's with Bitcoin in particular, like that's an interesting case because it sort of shows how the balance of power shifted away from the miners towards the developers in this case. And it seems like the developers have a pretty strong position so far in most of the blockchain projects that I've looked at.
So now, how does Decred compare to the other projects from this kind of perspective?
Yeah, Decred's really interesting from this kind of perspective for a number of reasons. The first one, like building on the constituencies thing, is that the Decred has built in ways for the users or the holders of the currency to play an active role in governance, and actually deliberately gives them the sort of dominant role in governance. It sets aside a lot of the kind of informal competition between different constituencies and within different constituencies in favor of a formalized approach based on voting by the users who lock up their coins and participate in proof of stake. So that's a big thing for Decred. Another big thing, like in relation to Decred and this approach, is the whole commons-based peer production philosophy. I think it's really strong in the Decred project. And although there are other projects that try and build in funding for development, I haven't found one that sort of treats that just as an extension of open source software development, which is what Decred does. So Decred's position on this is interesting. It's basically that yeah, this is an open source software project like many other open source software projects. The difference being that it's a blockchain that issues currency, and 10% of that currency is going into this fund, and that fund is just there to develop the project, including the software. So for me, that's really big, because it's not just unique in the blockchain space, it's unique in the whole commons-based peer production area. There's no other resource like this that can fund its own development without having to ask for donations, which entails having an organization that manages donations, or having to do something else that requires like centralization. So it's the only commons-based peer production project that has a decentralized funding source and a mechanism for deciding how that's used, which is also decentralized.
Understood. Rich, from your research, what are the general types of governance out there, and how does DCR's governance compare?
Yeah, so the main, if you want to sort of classify different types of governance, I'd say the big breakdown is between formal and informal governance. The sort of default in open source software and in most forms of commons-based peer production is for informal governance, because these projects start out small number of volunteers contributing together. Nobody's like disagreeing about anything. People, they're there because they agree on the value of the project, and they typically get along, and everything like usually goes pretty well. So that's, for that reason, at a small scale, there's not really a reason to require formal governance for these projects. But as the scale gets bigger and more, the project becomes more important to more people, then informal governance, like, it often falls down, because it's just not made to scale. Like, imagine a sort of town or city like running on rough consensus. It doesn't really work, because, well, for a wide number of reasons. But something, a formal approach that uses governance is, like, at a large scale, probably a better option, especially if you want to keep it easy to follow and for people to keep up with, because that's like, rough consensus is, it only really works for the people that can be directly involved. And those people, like, they don't really have a reason to listen to all the other people that aren't directly involved. There's a pretty big wall between those groups. The other aspect to sort of classifying cryptocurrency governance types is whether or not it relates to the consensus rules or to the broader development of the project. So there's, I mentioned before, quite a number of projects now that have some sort of development fund built into them, and some of them also allow some constituency to decide by voting on what that fund should be spent on. And it's an important aspect of governance for blockchains, in my view, because without that, the users of the project, their only choice is whether to accept or reject the changes that are presented by a particular group of developers. If you don't have any means to fund development of the project, then you're in a sort of take it or leave it situation. You see what the developers want to do, and you can decide as a kind of big disorganized collective of users and nodes and like exchanges, all the different actors, just sort of without a method of deciding what to do. Your option is either just to apply this hard fork update or not, or soft fork update, whatever kind of update is being presented. Whereas with the governance system that has a funding source, the participants in that system can have a lot more freedom to decide what they actually want from the project. And then, so there's the funding of development work, but there's also deciding whether or not the changes are activated. Without a method, that's a messy system. It's a system that, if there's any like kind of reasonable divide with a bunch of people on both sides, then you'll end up with two versions of the blockchain, which is, in my view, not desirable if it can be avoided, because it causes confusion, it causes a split in the community, and a split in all of the other resources that the community needs to survive and thrive. So it's better to be avoided. And there are a small number of projects that have taken that on as a kind of feature to coordinate the changes to the consensus rules. And Decred's the first one to do that to do it properly and have that working in production.
Rich, what do you think we could learn from projects like Decred?
Yeah, you can. So obviously enough, we can learn about how to govern a blockchain and how a system of governance based on users voting works. That in itself is pretty useful and interesting. But in my view, it also extends to all of the other commons-based peer production projects and a lot of other common pool resources, because it's basically about producing and governing a shared piece of global infrastructure with as much decentralization as possible. And there are lots of other areas of social economic life where that would be desirable if we could do it. So I'm hoping and expecting that with projects like Decred, we're going to be making some significant advances in this kind of decentralized governance. And if we can demonstrate that it works well, then I think there would be interest to learn from that and apply some of the lessons in other areas. So I mentioned Reddit before as an example. I think it's an interesting one because there's already a voting system there where there's a mechanism of deciding which posts are worth broadcasting, and it's somewhat decentralized because it's based on votes, but it doesn't really work that well at scale, because once that attention becomes a significant resource that people want, then they start abusing the system or gaming it to achieve that. They do things like create sock puppet accounts and like have lots of accounts that can vote up on their content and vote down on other people's related content. And you get things like voting brigades as well. So those are problems that come about, in my view, because of the open nature of these systems. So they're problems that are really applicable to any online community, where if the online community becomes important and becomes like something that people pay attention to, then it needs to have good defenses against being gamed and people just sort of participating for the sole purpose of leveraging that broadcast mechanism and deciding what people are going to see when they go on Reddit. So I see a lot of promise there with Decred's approach because of the way that it excludes like sock puppet or Sybil accounts. It doesn't matter, like it's not open to be gamed in that way, because just being an IP address isn't enough to get a say. You have to actually have some of the DCR. You have to be involved in that way to get a say in terms of the voting. Understood.
Now, something a bit off topic here. Why did you choose to be pseudonymous?
It's kind of a decision that I made in stages. So the first time that I decided whether to use my real name or not was when I joined the Decred chats. And I joined a lot of chats over the years. I don't usually use my full name. I usually use like some kind of handle. So that's what I did with Decred. But then when I started to write things, I needed to create accounts. I needed a Medium account and a Twitter account. And at that point, I thought about it and thought, well, what would, like, they know me as Richard, like, what would the point be of switching to use my full real name? And the only reason I could see to do that was because it might increase my credibility as to be like a real person with a title and affiliation, and like somebody who's like known in relation to something. That would thought maybe like is the only reason I could see to do it. And it didn't appeal to me because, so I'm generally in favor of like people trying to think for themselves and reason for themselves and make up their own minds about things. I don't really like, I'm not interested really in having people pay too much attention to what I say in terms of just going along with it. I'd rather, I like to, if people want to like read my perspective on stuff, but I'd really prefer that they make up their own mind. And that's from a pseudonym. I think it fits pretty well there. The other aspect is that I was just starting out with the blockchain stuff. I didn't necessarily have a lot of confidence that my perspective was valid or was really going to add much. So I didn't take it too seriously myself. So I didn't really want to mix it up with all of the but by using my real name, it would have been confounded with the other stuff that I've been doing in different areas, and it's not the same in many ways. Like, what a big thing is that I've never tried to publish a journal article about blockchains, so it's like a different approach to the publications for sure, and to some degree a different approach to the research, where by using the pseudonym I have a lot more freedom to not think too hard about where my opinions like situate me among my peers in my discipline, that kind of stuff. So that's, I went with the pseudonym at that point, and I've never seen any reason to change it. Nobody's ever suggested that I should, and it suits me pretty well. I enjoy it.
Got it. So, Rich, I appreciate you coming on the show. Do you have any closing statements for potential stakeholders?
Yeah, thanks very much for having me on the show, Angelo. I've enjoyed all of the other episodes, and I've been looking forward to getting on and talking to you on the podcast.
Appreciate it.
The closing statement, I would say that Decred's looking for stakeholders, particularly stakeholders that want to play an active role in securing the network and deciding how it should grow in the future. And because that's all happening in the open, you can watch it, you can see how that's been going, you can see what people think, what they've decided in terms of the consensus rules and in terms of the treasury spend. It's all there. You can have a look at what this community is about, and it should be pretty easy to decide if it's the kind of thing that you're interested in. If it is, then I would suggest that they get some credits and tickets, or otherwise just join the community and maybe see if there's something that you can help out with. Because there's the treasury, we have DCR to pay people for doing useful things, and nobody's defined in advance what those useful things are. So have a look. Maybe you can find something useful to do.
Excellent. Appreciate it, Rich.
Cool.